She was 56 years old, and she had just watched 31 years of her life get divided up like furniture at a yard sale. Not in a courtroom, not with lawyers present. Just in the dining room of the house, she had painted herself. At a table she had sanded and refinished twice, with a mediator named Gary who wore khakis, and spoke in the measured tone of a man who had learned to treat grief like a scheduling conflict. Her husband, Dennis, sat across from her with his hands folded, and his eyes pointed somewhere slightly above her left shoulder, the way a man looks when he has already moved on and is only waiting for the paperwork to catch up. The house in Clarksburg, West Virginia, went to Dennis because it was in Dennis's name. It had always been in Dennis's name, and Margaret had never thought to ask why, because back when they signed those papers, she still believed that a marriage was its own kind of deed, that you didn't need it written somewhere else. The savings account, what remained of it, after Dennis had spent 18 months quietly rerouting the larger deposits, came to $4,212. Her share, $4,000 after 31 years. She was 56 years old. She had a bad knee from the fall she took on the ice outside the grocery store in 2019 that Dennis had told her she was exaggerating. She had a nursing certification she had let lapse in 1998 when Dennis said they didn't need the money. And besides, the hours were too unpredictable. She had a 2014 Honda Civic with 140,000 miles on it and a rattle in the dashboard that she had stopped noticing somewhere around 2021, and she had a name she almost didn't recognize anymore. Margaret Pruett. That was her. 56 years old, $4,000, a rattling Civic, and a name that had spent 31 years being folded inside someone else's. Before we go any further, if this story is already reaching you, take 1 second right now and hit subscribe. And tell us down in the comments where in the world you're listening from. We have listeners all across this country, and we love knowing who's sitting with us tonight. Now let's get back to Margaret. Margaret Pruett had grown up in a small coal town in the eastern part of the state, the kind of town that appears on maps only as a dot. The kind of dot that keeps getting smaller every decade. Her mother, Ruth, had worked the lunchroom at the elementary school for 22 years. Her father, Carl, had worked the mine until the mine decided it was done with him at 54, after which he sat in a chair by the front window, watched the road the way men watch things they can no longer be part of. They were not unkind people. They were simply people to whom very little extra had ever been given, and who had learned not to reach. Margaret had been the reaching kind anyway. She reached all the way out of that town on a nursing scholarship at 19, reached far enough to meet Dennis Holloway at a 4th of July party in Morgantown, reached far enough to believe, when he told her she was the most capable woman he had ever met, that this was a thing a man says because it is true, and not because capable women are useful. She gave up the scholarship at the end of her second year. Dennis had a job offer in Clarksburg. It made sense for them to go together. She told herself she would go back to school, finish the certification, and she meant it, the way you mean, a thing before the years begin to close over it like water over a stone. She never went back. She raised their 2 children, Colton and Brianna, in the house in Clarksburg that was in Dennis's name. She drove them to school and to practice and to orthodontist appointments and stayed up late to help with projects and woke up early to pack lunches and did all the invisible work of a house and a family that people only notice when it stops getting done. She kept the garden. She repainted the dining room 3 times because Dennis kept changing his mind about the color. She sanded and refinished the dining room table twice, once in 2004 and once in 2015, and it was beautiful both times, and neither time did Dennis mention it. When Colton and Brianna were grown and gone, she suggested going back for the nursing certification. Dennis said the hours were too unpredictable. He said it the same way he had said it in 1998, with the same flat certainty, as though the intervening 20 years had not happened at all. So Margaret stayed home and kept the garden and repainted rooms and cooked meals that were eaten quickly and without comment. And she told herself that this was a life, and that many people had less, which was true. And told herself that Dennis loved her in his way, which she was less certain of, but had learned not to examine too closely. Then one Tuesday last October, she came home from her sister Carol's house to find a set of car keys on the kitchen counter that didn't belong to her. They were attached to a keychain she didn't recognize, a little silver letter S, and the coffee pot had been run recently, and there were 2 cups in the drying rack where Margaret never left more than one. She stood in her own kitchen for a long time, looking at those 2 cups. She didn't say anything to Dennis that night. She had spent 31 years learning the shape of a thing before she named it. She already knew what this was. She had already known for several months, probably, in the wordless way you know the weather is changing before anyone says a word about it. The divorce was filed in November. By February, the mediator named Gary had sorted out the furniture of their lives, and Margaret Pruett was sitting in the parking lot of a Sheetz gas station in Clarksburg. With $4,212 in a checking account, and nowhere particular to be, she moved into Carol's spare room. Carol was kind about it in the way that people are kind when they are also a little frightened by what they are seeing. Because Carol's own marriage was not what anyone would call solid. And a 56-year-old sister sleeping in your spare room is a difficult thing to look at for too long. Margaret understood this. She had cleaned up other people's difficult things her whole life. She did not begrudge Carol for not quite being able to hold her gaze. She applied for 3 jobs: a receptionist position at a pediatric office, a scheduling coordinator at a home health agency, and a part-time cashier at the grocery store on Pike Street. The pediatric office never called back. The home health agency said they were looking for someone with more recent experience. The grocery store called, and then 2 days later, called again to say the position had been filled internally. At 56, with a lapsed certification and a 31-year gap in her resume that read, in the language employers use, as simply nothing. She was finding that the world had moved on without her, in ways she had not fully understood while she was standing still. She sat in Carol's spare room in the evenings and counted the money a second time, the way you count a number you don't want to believe. Outside the window, the maple tree Carol's husband had planted, when their youngest was born, had gone gray and bare for the winter. The streetlight came on at 5:30. Margaret watched it come on and thought about the 2 cups in the drying rack, and did not cry, not because she wasn't sad, but because the sadness was too large and too settled, like something that had been living in the house with her for years, and had simply stopped pretending not to be there. She was not a woman given to self-pity. She had watched her father sit in that chair by the window for 11 years before he died, and she had promised herself when she was 16 that she would never become a person who simply watched the road. But there is a difference between sitting in the chair and having no road left to watch, and Margaret was beginning to understand that she had somehow ended up in both situations at once. Then in March, her mother's sister, her Aunt V, died. V. Pruett had been the eccentric branch of the family, which in the Pruett family meant she had moved somewhere. People thought was peculiar and refused to explain herself about it. In the late 70s she had loaded a truck and driven to a small town in southern Ohio called Cressy Falls, which had once been a modest mill town, and by 1978 was mostly just quiet. She had bought a building on the main street, an old dry goods store that had been empty for a decade, and she had turned it into a used bookshop she called The Margin, which Aunt V explained, referred both to the edges of book pages and to the thin edge of things where the most interesting notes get written. The family had thought this was impractical at best and peculiar at most. Margaret's mother had said, more than once, that V had never known how to do things the sensible way. But V had run the shop for 43 years, through 3 recessions and the internet and a pandemic, and she had, as far as anyone could tell, been entirely content. She had never married, never seemed to want to, never seemed to feel the absence of it. She had died in February at 81, quietly in the apartment above the shop, surrounded by approximately 800 books, and a cat named Periodical. The letter from the attorney came on a Wednesday. V had left everything to Margaret. The building, the inventory, the apartment upstairs. The attorney's letter was matter-of-fact about it. The property had been assessed at just under $40,000, though the attorney noted this was likely conservative, given recent interest in the downtown corridor. The shop itself had been closed since V's death. The cat had been taken in by a neighbor. There was some question, the attorney mentioned, about outstanding utility bills. Margaret read the letter twice at Carol's kitchen table. She and V had not been close, not in the way people sometimes imagine estrangements. There had been no falling out, no wound to point to. They had simply lived separate lives in the way that families do, when distance accumulates over years, and visits become rarer, and the phone calls shorter, and then one day you realize, it has been 6 years since you were in the same room. Margaret remembered V as a tall woman with reading glasses pushed up into silver hair, who laughed easily and had opinions about novels, and always sent Margaret books for her birthday, with small notes written inside the front covers in her cramped, slanted hand. She remembered the notes more than the books, now that she thought about it. Personal little observations, a sentence or two. V's handwriting in the margins. Carol said. Over dinner that night, that $40,000 was not nothing, and that selling quickly was probably the sensible move. Dennis's name wasn't on it, Carol pointed out, which was something. A fresh start, Carol said, looking slightly relieved at the phrase. Margaret said she needed to think about it. That night she lay in Carol's spare room and looked at the ceiling, and thought about the word that V had given her bookshop. The margin, the thin edge where the most interesting notes get written. She thought about all the margins of her own life, all the small things she had written there in the 31 years, while the main text of her marriage ran on without her. The garden, the table she had refinished twice, the meals no one commented on, the books V sent with notes tucked inside them. She had $4,000 and a bad knee and a rattling Honda and nowhere to go. She drove to Cressy Falls on a Thursday morning in March, when the sky was the color of old pewter and the fields along Route 50 still had patches of gray snow at the edges. It took 3 hours, and the rattle in the dashboard seemed to get louder the closer she got, as though the car itself had an opinion about the destination. Cressy Falls was smaller than she remembered from the one time she had visited, years ago, when the children were young. The mill had closed in the 90s and taken most of the economic logic of the town with it, but the main street was still there, a few blocks of brick storefronts from a century ago, some occupied and some not, a diner, a hardware store, a barber shop with an actual spinning pole. At the far end, set slightly apart from its neighbors, was a wide-fronted building with large windows, dark now, and above the door in faded gold letters that had once been painted carefully and had now worn down to something softer. The margin. Books. Margaret sat in the car in front of it for a long time. The building looked tired. One of the front windows had a crack sealed with tape. The paint on the door was peeling at the bottom. A handwritten sign, V's handwriting, she thought, said closed, and had been there long enough that the paper had gone yellow at the edges. She got out. She tried the key the attorney had mailed her. The lock turned. The smell was the first thing. Books and dust and the particular sweetness of old paper, and underneath it faint but present coffee. As though the building itself had been caffeinated for so long it had absorbed it into the walls. The shop was long and narrow, shelves running floor to ceiling on both walls, the shelves still full, V's inventory still exactly where she had left it. A wide wooden counter ran across the middle of the room, its surface worn glassy smooth from decades of books being set down and picked up and paid for. Behind the counter on the wall, V had hung a large painted sign in her own handwriting. Every book in here has already survived something. So have you. There was a reading chair in the corner near the front window, angled to catch the afternoon light, a small table beside it with a lamp and an empty coffee cup still in the ring it had left on the wood, still waiting to be washed. The cup stopped Margaret where she stood. She recognized it. It was the cup V had used the one time Margaret had visited, years ago, a blue enamel mug with a small chip on the rim that V had painted over in a slightly wrong shade of blue. You could still see the chip if you knew to look for it. Margaret knew to look for it. She stood there for a long time, in the quiet of her dead aunt's bookshop, looking at a coffee cup with a painted chip, and felt something she had not expected. The particular sensation of walking into a room where someone has only just left, the air still settling, the warmth still in the walls. If you're listening to this story and it's already getting to you, take 1 second and hit subscribe, and leave us a comment. Tell us about someone in your life you misunderstood for years before you finally saw the truth. We'd love to hear it. Now let's get back to Margaret. She found the stairs to the apartment behind a door at the back of the shop. The apartment was 2 rooms and a small kitchen, and it was exactly what the apartment of a woman who had lived alone with 800 books for 40 years would look like. Orderly but layered, every surface with its purpose, nothing wasted. A pair of reading glasses folded on the nightstand beside a library book that had been due in December and that someone would eventually have to deal with. A kettle on the stove. A calendar on the wall still turned to February, with small notations in each square in V's hand. Orders coming in, a dentist appointment, the name of a book she had apparently been waiting for. And on the kitchen table, as though V had set it there on purpose, which Margaret would later decide she had. A small wooden box, the kind that holds recipe cards or photographs, with the word margins written on the lid in V's slanted hand. Margaret sat down and opened it. Inside were index cards, hundreds of them filled on both sides in V's cramped handwriting, each one dated at the top. She took out the first one. It was dated 1981. She read. Then she read the next one. Then she couldn't stop. They were not a diary, not exactly. They were more like the notes V wrote inside books, short, specific, observational. Each card was about a person, a customer mostly. A sentence or two of description, a note about why they had come in, what they had left with, sometimes what they had said, and sometimes in V's economical hand, a follow-up from later. What became of them? Whether she ever heard. March 1981. A man named Robert, driving through on his way to somewhere he didn't say, sat in the corner chair for 2 hours, left with a copy of Steinbeck. Didn't have quite enough. I told him the book had a pricing error and charged him half. October 1984. A girl of about 19 with a bruise on her cheek she'd powdered over. Stayed most of the day reading. I didn't ask. Made her tea. She left with a notebook and 3 books she said she'd come back and pay for. I told her I'd put them on her tab. She never came back, and that was fine. That was the point. June 1989. A family, mother and 3 kids passing through after the father left. The mother hadn't slept, you could tell. I put the kids in the children's corner with a stack of picture books and sat with the mother for an hour. I didn't know what to say, so I just made coffee. She said she'd forgotten what it felt like to sit down somewhere quiet. She took a novel and a book of poems and didn't have money for either. And I told her they'd been there 30 years and weren't going anywhere. Margaret read for 2 hours. The daylight moved across the table. She forgot that her knee ached. She forgot the rattle in the Honda downstairs. She forgot for a while that she was 56 years old and had $4,000 and nowhere to go. Card after card after card. 43 years of people who had come through the door of a small used bookshop in a small Ohio town. People who needed to sit somewhere quiet. People who needed something to read on a hard night. People who needed, more than they needed any particular book, to be somewhere that didn't ask them to explain themselves. Where the sign on the wall told them they had already survived something and were believed. And in between the customer cards, in a different color of ink, shorter notes that V had written to herself. Little prayers, Margaret thought, in the language of a woman who was better with books than with God. Keep the chair in the corner. Someone always needs it. A shop that only serves the people who can afford it is just a store. This is something else. I am not selling books. I am selling the hour inside them. Margaret set the last card down and looked out the kitchen window at the narrow street below. The afternoon light had gone pale and slanted. A car passed slowly. Someone walked a dog. The town was quiet in the way that small towns are quiet in March, not empty, just resting, waiting for the season to turn. Her hands were not quite steady. She had known in some vague family way that V ran a bookshop. She had not known this. She had not known that her aunt had spent 43 years keeping a chair empty for whoever needed to sit down in it. She had not known about the girl with the powdered bruise, or the mother who had forgotten what quiet felt like, or the hundreds of other people who had come through that door and been met without questions. She had not known that she had an aunt who had lived an entire life this way. And she had spent 31 years in a house in Clarksburg, sanding a table no one noticed, while this was happening 200 miles away in a town she had visited once. She sat with that for a long time. Then she came back downstairs and stood behind V's counter, with her hands flat on the worn wood, and looked at the full shelves and the reading chair in the corner, and the blue enamel mug she had carried down from the apartment and set on the counter because it seemed wrong to leave it upstairs. A bookshop. She had never run a business. She had no idea how any of it worked. But she had spent 31 years running a household, which meant she knew how to manage money and time, and the 1,000 small logistics of a place where people live and eat and need things. She knew how to show up every day and do the work that doesn't get thanked. She knew how to sit with someone without filling the silence. She drove back to Carol's that night and lay in the spare room looking at the ceiling. Carol, over breakfast, the next morning said again that selling was probably sensible. A bookshop in a small town, Carol said. You don't have any experience in retail, Maggie, and that building is going to need work. She wasn't wrong. Margaret knew she wasn't wrong. But she was also thinking about a girl with a powdered bruise who had sat all day in a corner chair and left with 3 books she'd never pay for, and about what it meant that V had called that the point. And she was thinking about a line from one of the cards, one she couldn't get out of her head, that V had written on a rainy Tuesday in November 1997, after a day she described as slow and cold and worth every minute of it. "A shop like this doesn't make money," she had written. "It makes something harder to name and more important to have. A place in the world where what you're carrying doesn't matter as much as what you're looking for." Margaret went back to Cressy Falls on a Saturday. She spent the day going through the inventory, which was larger than she had realized. The back room had shelves she hadn't found on the first visit, floor to ceiling, organized in a system only V fully understood. She found a logbook on a shelf under the counter. V's records, 40 years of them, inventory bought and sold, but also, tucked in the back pages in no particular order, a running list she had called the chair list. Names, dates, one-line notes. Margaret cross-referenced a few against the index cards. They matched. Every name on the chair list had a card in the wooden box. There were, by her count, over 300 names. She was sitting at the counter reading through the logbook when she heard a knock at the glass door. She looked up. A woman about her age, maybe a few years older, stood on the sidewalk with her hands in her coat pockets, looking at the closed sign with an expression that Margaret could only describe as hoping anyway. Margaret got up and unlocked the door. The woman said her name was Pat, and she had driven from Gallipolis 40 minutes, because she had heard on a neighborhood Facebook group that someone might be reopening the margin, and she had wanted to see for herself, because V. Pruett had been the first person to recommend a book that made Pat feel. She said, and then she stopped and looked at the ceiling for a second. "That made me feel like my life was worth examining," she finally said. "Like it was the kind of life that could be in a book. She gave me that book in 2006 when my husband died, and I didn't know what to do with myself, and I have bought a book here every month since. And I just wanted to say that if you're opening it again, then I will be here." Margaret made them both coffee on the small electric kettle she'd brought from Carol's. They sat in the reading chair and on the step stool from the back room. And Pat talked about V the way people talk about a place that held them at a specific moment, with that particular gratitude that is really for the moment more than the person, though it is also for the person. She said V never tried to fix her. She said V had this way of handing you a book like she was handing you a key to a room you hadn't known was locked. More people came over the next 2 weeks. Not many, not at once, a few at a time, knocking at the glass or catching Margaret in the parking lot behind the building when she was carrying boxes of donations that had been left on the doorstep. A retired teacher who had brought her 7th grade class in every year for a decade. A man who had been sleeping in his car the winter of 2010, and whom V had allowed to sit in the back room on cold days without asking questions. A young woman 30 maybe, who had grown up in Cressy Falls, and who said the first book she ever chose for herself, the first book that was hers and not an assignment, had been picked out by an old lady, with reading glasses in her hair, who sat with her for an hour until they found the exact right one. They came the way the visitors had come to the wagon wheel, one by one, as though the closing of one light calls the people who needed it back to the place where it had burned. Margaret listened to all of them. She took notes on index cards. She found blank ones in the supply drawer under the counter, the same brand V had used, and she started her own. She was there the morning a man in a company truck came by to discuss acquiring the property. He had a business card that said Commercial Development Consultant, and he shook her hand with a grip that wanted to be reassuring, and came out the other side into presumptuous. He said the building had potential, though not as a retail space. Retail in these towns being what it was. He said there was interest from a regional wellness company, wellness being the growth sector in secondary markets. He used the phrase secondary markets 3 times. He offered her $80,000 and called it a strong offer for the area, and then looked at the shelves of used books. The way a man looks at something he has already decided is clutter. Margaret asked him why his company was interested in a secondary market. He said the location had certain attributes: access, visibility, the structural soundness of the building. She asked him if his company had looked into the building's historical designation status, because when she had looked into it, she had found that the building had been registered as a local historical landmark by the Cressy Falls Historical Commission in 2014, which carried with it a set of use restrictions and a renovation protocol that applied to any new owner regardless of purchase. The man's smile shifted slightly. He said he wasn't aware of that designation. She said she thought he might not be. She also said that V, before she died, had worked with a local preservation attorney to place a deed restriction on the building. Not a landmark status, which could be challenged, but a private restriction, attached to the deed itself, specifying that the ground floor must be operated as a community reading space or bookshop in perpetuity. The attorney had been thorough. The restriction would survive any sale. She told him she had found this in a folder in the back of the logbook, filed neatly behind the chair list, in the particular way of a woman who had spent 43 years making sure important things stayed findable. The man left his card anyway. She put it in the recycling bin behind the counter, next to the broken stapler and an outdated phone book. Later that week, Carol called and asked when Margaret was planning to come back. Margaret said she wasn't sure she was. Carol was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that is also a decision, and then said she supposed she could see that. She said she'd mail the rest of the boxes. Margaret thanked her. She had already moved into the apartment upstairs. She had cleaned it and aired it and bought a new kettle. Because the old one had started making a sound she didn't trust, and she had carried the wooden box of index cards down to cough counter where she could reach it easily. And she had put the blue enamel mug with the painted chip on the shelf above the register where she could see it from anywhere in the room. She reopened the margin on a Wednesday in April, a day with pale spring sunlight coming through the front windows at exactly the angle V had placed that reading chair to receive. She swept the floor. She dusted the shelves. She filled the kettle. She put a new sign in the window, written in her own handwriting, working to make it legible enough, not as good as V's but hers, open. The first customer was the retired teacher, who came in at 10:15 and stood in the doorway for a moment looking at the shelves and said, simply, "Good," and then came to the counter and asked what was new. Margaret said that, to be honest, most of it was old. The teacher laughed and said that was exactly right, and browsed for an hour, and bought 2 books and a small ceramic dish from the bowl of odd little items V had kept on the counter, and left a $10 donation in the jar labeled for the chair, meaning the fund Margaret had started, following V's example, to make sure there was always enough float to cover a book for someone who needed one. And before I tell you what happened in the weeks after that, if this story is speaking to you, take 1 second and subscribe to Giant Stories. And tell us in the comments, who is someone in your life you thought you understood, but didn't until it was almost too late to know the truth about them. We'd love to read every single one. Now back to Margaret. The people came, not in a flood, not overnight, but steadily, in the way that good things accumulate when you stop trying to force them into a shape and just leave the door open. A high school kid who came in every day after school and sat in the corner chair and never bought anything for the first 3 weeks. And then one day told her he didn't have any money, and she told him the chair wasn't for sale. A woman recovering from surgery who read her way through V's entire mystery section in 6 weeks. A veterans group from the county that started meeting in the back room on Thursday evenings, because their organizer said it was quieter than the library and smelled better than the VFW hall. Margaret let them all in. She learned their names. She wrote cards. She learned the building's moods the way you learn a person's moods. Which floorboard creaked at what angle, which window let in a draft when the wind was from the northwest, which shelf needed a brick behind it to stand level. She learned which books V had shelved in unusual places and why, because there was always a reason. V's logic running underneath the organizational system like water under ice. A shelf she labeled geography held maps, yes, but also certain novels, books about people who had to cross distances to find themselves. A shelf labeled unfinished business held half-read books people had returned, and second-tep classics, and one slim volume of poetry that had been brought back 4 times by 4 different people who said they just couldn't get into it, which V had annotated on the inside cover, returned October 2003, March 2009, January 2016, February 2021. Still waiting for its reader, Margaret added, April 2024. Found her. She found things tucked in the pages of books throughout the inventory, a grocery list from 1987, a birthday card never sent, a photograph of a child on a beach, no names written anywhere, a note in a paperback thriller that said simply, "This one gets better, keep going." She did not know if V had written it for a customer or for herself. It seemed possible it was both. One morning in May she found, in a copy of a novel she was shelving after a donation, a note on a yellow post-it stuck to the title page. The handwriting was V's, the slanted, cramped hand she recognized now as well as she recognized her own. It said, "For whoever needs this, and it's probable you do, since you found your way here." Margaret held the book for a long time. She had spent 31 years being told, in one way or another, by one person or another, what she was not. Not experienced enough, not recent enough, not young enough. She had spent 31 years in a house that was not in her name doing work that left no record. She had come here with $4,000 and a bad knee and a 2014 Honda that rattled. And she had found, in the margins of her dead aunt's life, a record of everything she herself had always been but never had a language for. The woman who stayed. The woman who noticed. The woman who made coffee when she didn't know what to say and sat with people in the quiet without trying to fill it. She had been doing this her whole life. She had simply been doing it for one man who didn't notice, in one house that wasn't hers, in one marriage that had been appraised at $4,000, and a rattling Civic. Now she was doing it here. V had not been an eccentric. V had not been impractical. V had been, with absolute precision, exactly who she meant to be, in exactly the place she meant to be, and she had known it, and she had done it deliberately, and she had left a deed restriction to make sure it couldn't be undone. And then she had left a box of cards and a painted coffee mug and a reading chair in the window and the rest of it to Margaret. Not because Margaret was the nearest relative, not out of obligation. Because V had, in the way of people who keep close track of the people they love, seen something in Margaret that Margaret had not yet seen in herself. Margaret Pruett understood this, the way you understand something that has always been true of you, but that you needed a different room to see. In October, 6 months after she reopened, she was behind the counter on a Tuesday afternoon, when the bell above the door rang and a woman came in who looked the way Margaret had looked in the parking lot of the Sheets in February. Held together carefully, a little too carefully, the specific expression of a person who is not going to cry in front of a stranger no matter what. She was maybe 45. She had a child with her, a girl of about 7. With pigtails who went immediately to the picture books. The children go to exactly what they need. The woman stood in the middle of the shop and looked at the sign on the wall. Every book in here has already survived something, so have you. She stood looking at it for a long moment. Margaret said nothing. She had learned from V's cards and from her own 31 years that some people need the question and some people need the quiet. And you learn to tell them apart by who breathes first. The woman breathed first. She said she was just passing through and saw the sign in the window and had always meant to stop at a place like this and never did. And today she just stopped. Margaret said that was usually how it worked. The woman laughed. A short surprise sound, the laugh of someone who hadn't expected to laugh today. Margaret made her tea and let her browse. The little girl read picture books in the corner chair, her feet not reaching the floor. The woman found a novel on the geography shelf and brought it to the counter, and Margaret could see, without looking for it, the particular way she held herself, the slight tightening across the shoulders of a person who has been braced for a long time. She told her the book was on the house. The woman started to protest, and Margaret said the previous owner had left a fund for exactly this, which was true. She said the only thing she asked in return was that the woman sign the copy on the title page. First name only if she preferred. The woman wrote her name. Margaret took the book back and looked at it, and then wrote beneath the name, in her own handwriting, the thing V had taught her to say with coffee and a chair and an unsigned tab. "Glad you stopped?" She wrote the woman's name on an index card that evening, the first of many she had filled since April. She kept them in a new wooden box she had bought at the hardware store on Main Street and had labeled in her own handwriting, the margin, Volume 2. She put it next to V's box on the shelf under the counter, the two of them side by side, hundreds of cards between them. 300 names and growing, a ledger not of debt but of presence. Every person who had ever come in out of the cold or the rain or a hard Tuesday and found the door open. She closed up that evening the way she did every evening, lights off in the back, kettle off, chairs straight, the blue enamel mug on its shelf above the register, the reading chair turned just so to catch the morning light when it came. She stepped outside and turned to lock the door, and she stood for a moment on the sidewalk and looked up at the sign, the margin. Books. The gold letters worn down to something softer but still readable. Still legible to anyone who was looking. She had put a lamp in the front window. Nothing much, a small thing, a table lamp from the apartment that gave a warm yellow light. She left it on all night. It had not been planned exactly. She had just turned it on one evening in January when it was dark, early, and cold, and she had thought about the kind of people who drive past small-town storefronts on cold evenings and what it is to see a light on in a window. It costs almost nothing, she had thought, and a person driving in the dark cannot always tell. She stood on the sidewalk and looked at the lamp in the window and the faded gold letters and the worn boards of the door, and she felt something settle in her chest with the particular weight of a thing that is exactly where it is meant to be. She had been 56 years old with $4,000, and a rattling car and a life she had spent 31 years building inside someone else's name. She had come here with nothing but a key from an attorney and a dead aunt she had not known well enough. And she had found, inside a wooden box on a kitchen table, proof that someone had seen her, had seen what she was, what she could hold, what she could keep, and had left her the exact place in the world where that was what was needed. All the years you think you're standing still, someone somewhere is keeping a chair warm for you. Margaret Pruett locked the door of the margin on a Tuesday night in October, the anniversary of the morning. She had come home to 2 cups in the drying rack, and a marriage already over. She walked around the corner to the door that led to the apartment stairs. She climbed them slowly, in the way of a woman with a bad knee, who has been on her feet all day and doesn't mind. She filled the kettle. She put on the lamp. She picked up V's copy of the November card from 1997, the one about what the shop made that wasn't money. And she set it on the kitchen table where she could read it again in the morning. Then she sat down and opened a blank card. She wrote the date at the top. She thought about the woman with the little girl and the pigtails, about Pat from Gallipolis, about the veterans on Thursday evenings, about the boy who sat in the chair for 3 weeks before he told her he couldn't pay. She thought about V, who had spent 43 years writing cards in a wooden box that no one was supposed to see but her, keeping track the way you keep track of a thing you love, in the private way, the way that asks nothing back. She had thought her whole life that she was the woman things happened to, the woman left behind. She had believed this so long and so completely that she had not been able to see what V had seen from 200 miles away, through 6 years of silence and a handful of birthday books, with notes tucked inside. That Margaret Pruett was not a woman things happened to. She was a woman who stayed, who noticed, who made coffee when she didn't know what to say, and sat with people in the quiet and did not ask them to be other than they were, who kept the thing running that nobody thanks you for keeping until it is gone. She was, in other words, exactly what a place like this had always needed. She just had to lose everything else before she could find her way here. Margaret wrote one more line on the card, the line she had decided to put at the bottom of every one from now on, the same way V had ended every card, with the same 3 words about why she did it. She wrote it in her own hand in the slanted script that didn't look like V's but was becoming its own thing now, her own margin, her own record. Keep the chair open. She closed the box. She turned off the kitchen lamp. She left the lamp in the window on, the way she always did, the small yellow square of light visible from the street below, from the corner, from the road that ran through Cressy Falls and went on out into the dark, where the people who needed it were still driving, still looking, still hoping there was somewhere along the way that had left a light on. There was. There always was, as long as someone decided to stay.